Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Saturdays in Stores podcast, which you can find, as always, right here on the Crossover channel. I'm your host, as always, Kanaye Tesoro. And for this video today, I kind of just want to do another breakdown video of some of the other off-season practice rumblings that have kind of circulated through the circles of UConn men's basketball. Just yesterday, I believe on the day of this recording, Dan Hurley's most recent media availability from practice went up on the UConn Huskies YouTube channel. So I definitely think it's worth a watch if you haven't seen it. But basically, this video today, I'm just going to break down a lot of the takeaways that I got from what Dan Hurley said. I think he had a lot of really great things to say about how this year's team is really coming along through this second, I guess you could say, second off-season practice session. I know they had the first one. They had a brief period of break where the players could go home, see their families, and do whatever they wanted to, and then they had to come back. This was a second session. This time around, they were kind of able to have more of the full roster there with Furphy and Eric Ryba not having to play over in that U19 World Cup. They were able to be in STORRS for practice. Same thing goes with Malachi, kind of bringing him further along with his whole injury rehab process, which Dan Hurley had some good things to say about how he's kind of progressed with that process as well. But I'm basically just, again, going to break down what I was able to take away from what Dan had to say in that media availability. But before we get into that, as you all know, the algorithm is key for what drives content configuration on this platform, which is YouTube. So it goes a really, really long way if all of you watching can engage with our videos in any way you can, whether it's liking, subscribing to our channel, or just telling other people about the Crossover channel. It goes a really long way with continuing to build what me and Josh have here at the Crossover. Of course, the last video on the Saturdays in Stores podcast did really, really well last week. So I want to thank you all watching for continuing to just pump out some really great viewership in over this month and a half kind of stretch that this channel has gone on. So again, really thankful for the viewership that you guys have brought and hope you guys keep it up. But let's not waste any more time and get right into it. I think a good place to start is kind of just in terms of where Dan Hurley kind of is just viewing the whole overall vibes he kind of had in the video. I definitely think he seems to feel a lot better about where this roster is as opposed to where this past year's roster was around the same time of the summer. In that kind of end of July, early August stretch of the offseason, where last year reporters might have asked Dan some questions about kind of where he was figuring out lineups and rotations, what guys' roles might end up being. And Dan Hurley kind of he would tend to maybe scratch his head and maybe answer questions without the level of certainty that you'd want to hear out of your head coach. I think there was a lot of unknowns, even with the UConn coaching staff, where he's answering questions a lot more confidently. He knows of course, there's always that debate for the 3 spot kind of between Braylan Mullins and Jalen Stewart. But outside of that, there's a lot more certainty in the answers he's giving. And that's not even a bad thing, the positional debate there between Mullins and Stewart, where I genuinely believe I think both guys are going to bring great skill sets to the table. And I'm going to talk about that later in this video today. But to get into kind of the first point that Hurley really brought up, it was really just him continuing to kind of praise the skill sets that Braylan Mullins brings to the table. I know people have gone to great lengths, and I've talked about already. John Rothstein, Dan Hurley, other people who have sat in UConn practices have really given Braylan Mullins a lot of high praise in terms of what he could end up being for this UConn program going to this year. But I think what really kind of sets it in stone as to the type of player that UConn might be getting with Braylan Mullins this season is the group of names that Dan Hurley kind of threw out of Braylan Mullins potentially being able to be in the company of at the conclusion of the season. He threw out the names of the guys like Alex Karaban, Donovan Clingan, Stephon Castle, and Liam McNeely in terms of high-impact freshmen who could be big-time contributors right off the bat and be legit stars for this program. And for Braylan Mullins to be in that company, to have potentially have a chair at that table with the likes of some of those star freshmen that UConn has had over the last 3 seasons. Again, I don't think there's enough that you could put into words in terms of how beneficial that would be to have someone step in right away. And I do think Hurley kind of made a really, really good point where Mullins is stepping into a lot better of a situation than McNeely was last year, where McNeely, there's a lot of guys who are in new roles, defining the way they played in terms of just, again, you needed guys to make leaps. You had guys in new roles once again. Solo was a starter. Caravan was kind of supposed to be the go-to guy. You didn't know what the whole point guard situation was going to be. Samson Johnson, first year as a starting center. You had a lot of youth coming off the bench. This year, it's a lot more different. Guys are a year older. There's more defined roles. You know what you have a point guard with Silas Demary Jr. Solo Ball will be back with a full year starting under his belt. Alex Karaban will be back for his senior season as a 4-year starter. Tarris Reed will have hopefully be up to speed and ready to be the starting center for this program. And Braylan Mullins, whether he starts or he comes off the bench as a sixth or seventh man, then I think he's in a great spot where there's so much experience, there's so much proven winners that he's going to be on the court with that have seen everything you possibly can in college basketball. They've been through the highs, they've been through the lows, and I think that's going to take so much pressure off of Braylan Mullins. And he's not going to be the situation that Liam was last year, where pretty much following Maui, Liam was kind of the go-to guy, where he was really the only true creator off the ball, or off the dribble, I should say. This year, Braylan's probably going to end up being like a third or fourth option when he is on the floor. And I think that's going to benefit him a lot. I think a lot of people point to his kind of not great performance in the McDonald's All-American game, but I do think it is important to know that I just don't think that his skill set benefits from a game like the McDonald's All-American, where you're on the floor with a lot of five stars who a lot of people want to wow the crowd and show what they can do on the national spotlight there. And Braylan, I think, is more of a team-oriented player. Dan Hurley's spoken to what he brings as a passer, along with, of course, the shooting, which everyone has gloated about up to this point. But again, I think Braylan, Dan Hurley's talked about how he really, really does believe Braylan's going to guard at a high level, which is important. That kind of also alluded to the Jalen versus Braylan debate, where he did talk about Jalen Stewart, said Jalen Stewart's had an amazing offseason. Jalen knows what he's had to attack in terms of how to get better going into this next season. And it was really interesting to hear Dan Hurley kind of talk to about, because he went to fair length in describing how Jalen kind of decided to, this offseason, put down the gaming controller, get off the game, and start hitting the court more. He said his workout schedule is very, very similar to what Alex Caravan's is. This is something I definitely felt was kind of the case where, again, I didn't know, I don't know how I didn't go to any extremity and say that Jalen Stewart was an avid gamer and maybe that was taking time away from the on-court work he could be getting in. But I did think that, maybe at the conclusion of his freshman year, like I've talked about so much on this podcast, where he came on late in the year in the rotation, was able to have some big moments like in the Big East Tournament Championship against Marquette, was able to play in flurries throughout the NCAA tournament as well. I think a lot of hypes around his name, especially draft rumors going into this past season. But I think that might have, I don't know if got to his head is the right way to phrase it, but I think maybe it kind of allowed Stewart to ease up a little bit too much than what he should have. And this year he knows now that, I have an opportunity to start if I come in and really lock in this offseason and attack what I need to do in terms of me improving as a basketball player. You know how talented he is as an offensive threat. 3-level scorer, can shoot, can get into the painted area, can hit shots off the dribble. At times, I think the big thing for him is just becoming a marquee level defender, which is what Dan Hurley talked about, where, yeah, that position's up for grabs here between Mullins and Stewart. I think it's pretty firmly a two-man race between those two guys for the last starting spot, the 3 on the wing. But a lot of who's going to win that battle is going to come down to who gives you the best ability to guard at the highest level possible in your starting lineup once opening night comes around. And I think Dan Hurley alluded to, Stewart has the great size, the great length on the wing. And if he is able to play defense at a high level, which I'm a firm believer he can, I've talked about the job he did on Eric Dixon several times. He defended him over the course of this past season. Eric Dixon was the leading scorer in the country, and Stewart held him to not great shooting numbers, and was able to try to keep him off the foul line at times, which of course is really hard to do. But again, I'm a firm believer that if Jalen Stewart can prove that he is a viable defensive option to have on the floor, then I don't see why he can't win that starting battle. And I'm here for it, because I think I'm really not all too worried about who ends up winning that battle. I think both guys, again, really are unique in their own ways, and they're going to bring a lot of different options to the table in terms of what they can do on the court. Now, to get into kind of the next point, which I felt was really, really fascinating, was the talk about Tarris Reed, because Dan Hurley was asked a question about Eric Riba, where he was asking, what do you like about Eric Riba and what he brings offensively? And he went to length, spoke fairly briefly about what Eric Riba is. I mean, we've kind of known that Eric Riba is a super offensively skilled talent coming in. You don't see a lot of big men coming with the talent that Eric Riba is, just with the ability to have a low post presence and back to the basket game, as well as being able to step out and hit the 3-point shot. He's solid in screen situations. I think Dan Hurley's going to love running him through with DHOs and possible pick and pops, of course, with the shooting dimension he brings there. But he kind of talked about how Eric has had the privilege of being able to play against a guy like Tarris Reed every single day at practice since he's got into STORRS following the World Cup. And how he kind of compared that to the situation that Donovan Clingan was in going into his freshman year, being able to practice against Adama Sanogo every single day. Now, we all know how dominant Adama was in his junior season when they won the national championship in 23. He was the Final Four most outstanding player that year. Just, again, you hear everyone talk about how relentless and dominant Adama was, not only on the game floor, but in practice as well. And Donovan, even when he got drafted, went to great lengths in his post-draft interviews and talked about how Adama was such a key part of Klingen's his own developmental process and becoming a player that was ready to step on the floor in the Big East and compete at the highest level in the national spotlight in March going into his sophomore season. I think it was indicative to tell you how much that competing against a guy the level of an Adamo did for Klingen's development and really set him up to be able to compete at a high level once he was given the starting reins. And I think from what I've heard from Dan, because I talked about in last week's episode where there hasn't been much talk about Tarris Reed up to this point in the offseason, which was really interesting because I think he could end up being one of, if not the most important players for this UConn team this year, where I just think that a big concern last year was kind of center play, but I just think a lot of people, there's still a lot of doubters surrounding Tarris Reed. And I think it's fair because you understand there are the lapses mentally sometimes on the floor where he maybe makes the wrong read, makes a mistake defensively, puts UConn in a position where the rim is not being protected where he should be. I think catching the ball is also a concern at times, but though he got better throughout the course of the season in all aspects of the game and everything I just described. But I think the main thing for Tarris this offseason is just continue to hammer away at kind of improving in the above the shoulders aspects of the game because the talent's there. The natural talent, the athleticism, he moves really, really great laterally. He can get up and down the floor. I'd argue he moves almost as well as some guards. I really do believe that Tarris is a great natural athlete. Again, it's really just the above the shoulders aspect of the game for Tarris, being able to process the game the right way, let it kind of come to him, being able to recognize when a double team is coming towards him and finding the open man, hitting that guy to get him a good look. I think that's going to take Tarris' game to the next level. And Dan Hurley came out and said that he believes that Tarris can be a top 2 or 3 center in the country this year. And I'm honestly, I'll back Dan up on that. I really do believe that Tarris Reed has a great chance at becoming potentially an All-American or an All-League player in the Big East. Me and Josh talked about it. This is kind of shaping out to be what it seems on paper a weaker year for bigs. I think by far the best center in the country going into this year is Zuby Ejiofor at St. John's. And I honestly would make an argument that Tarris Reed would probably be right behind him. And I think the door's open for Tarris Reed to have an Adama-like season where he's able to contend for an All-American team, be an All-League player on the first team of the Big East potentially, and be someone who could average, 16 and 10 on any given night, maybe 14 and 8. Someone who's really crucial to just what this UConn team does defensively, because defense is still one of the concerns I have for this roster, though I do think there are better individual defenders on this year's roster as opposed to last. And I think altogether that the size that this lineup will have is going to help. The length, I think, will help. It's a lot tougher to get around lengthier, taller players, and I think this UConn lineup has that, which is going to definitely benefit Tarris down low, just considering you don't have the 7'2", Great Wall of Bristol, as Rob Doster likes to call Donovan Clingan anymore with that program. But I think Tarris Reed, the anticipation time, he needs to get a little bit better defensively, but if he can do that, then I think UConn's in a really good spot. Eric Ryba, Dan had talked about, again, a really skilled offensive player, but if he can kind of be sort of on the cusp of getting towards where Donovan Clingan was as a defensive rim protector, then I think that's going to be really important. I've came out and gone on the record and said I think if Eric Ryba could be 50, even just 50% of what Donovan Clingan was defensively, then UConn is in a great spot. If he's more than that, then even better. But I think Dan Hurley has a lot of high expectations for Tarris this year, and I'm really excited to see Tarris because I think I'm a firm believer that Tarris Reed is going to have a massive, massive year in STORRS. Before I get into the last point that I was really able to take away from that video of Dan Hurley's media availability, really just quickly, I do think it's important to note that Dan Hurley said that Jaden Ross has had a really, really good offseason. I know in the practices that people were able to sit in and watch. Jaden had a really good showing there. Didn't shoot the ball great, Dan admitted, which is still kind of a level of concern because we've all kind of been hoping that J. Ross can kind of come along and be that legit 3-and-D threat that we've been hoping he could be for the last, I guess, really only year at this point. But again, he does everything else on the court, which is what Dan said. He makes a lot of the tough Glue guy plays. He's willing to get on the floor, dive for loose balls, which is what we saw last year. He's able to defend at a fairly high level. You look at what he did against the likes of Nemhard when they played Gonzaga at the Garden. The job he did defending Cam Jones in the games against Marquette, I think was really admirable too. And again, I think if you can find confidence in the shot, it's going to be hard to keep Jaden Ross off the floor in the rotation. I think he's going to be a vital piece to what UConn's depth could end up being this year. As for a team that we think could end up potentially being 10 deep, we'll see if Dan Hurley decides to turn to a 10-man rotation. But again, I think Jaden Ross can be a really important piece of what could potentially be a super, super deep UConn team this year. Now, again, to get in the last point, it really revolves around Silas Demary Jr. And this isn't only from what Dan had to say in his media availability, just in terms of I've watched several film breakdowns on Silas up to this point, and I've also watched a few interviews he's done where he's kind of sat in on some talk shows and just talked about kind of the whole process of him choosing UConn out of the transfer portal and kind of what his career was at Georgia so far in his college playing days. And I gotta say, I think Dan, the most important thing that Dan talked about was how you know what you're gonna have a point guard this year, which I think is really important because that was a complete unknown last year around this time in the offseason for UConn, where you didn't know what the deal was going to be between Mahaney and Diarra, who between the two was maybe going to end up starting and being the lead guard for this past year's UConn team. This year, pretty firm, it's going to be Silas Demary Jr. running the point. And he's talked about how Silas has gotten better in pretty much every single outing, every single day of every practice. And that's the important thing because I've talked about it a lot, and anyone who covers UConn basketball talks about how it's so hard for first-year transfers or freshmen to come in and fully grasp what UConn does, both offensively and defensively, with their systems, their sets, their schemes right away, especially for point guards. It's so hard. You tend to hit a roadblock, which is what we saw with Tristan Newton in his first year at UConn, where really kind of got actually out to a pretty solid start, but that January stretch was really where TNU struggled a lot. And by the end, or I should say, by the time the tournament came rolling around that year, you could argue he's probably the best player on the floor for UConn and kind of was going forward through the next year too, being the legendary year that TNU had in his grad year. But I think to hear that Silas is getting better every single day, I think is so important. If you could kind of, not going to say avoid the roadblock, because I do think there is going to be an adjustment period for Silas, as there is for any UConn guard who is coming over and playing in their first year with the program. But I think if you kind of reduce the on-court mishaps, which might end up happening, where Dan Hurley's talked about how the main thing for Silas right now is kind of just for him when he passes that half-court logo, him just being able to read the floor, deciding whether he wants to take the drive himself, throw the lob to whoever's in the dunker spot down low, or pass it off to one of the wings out on the perimeter and run. That just, I think that's what's most important right now, him being able to visualize what he's able to get off of what the defense is showing from the sets that UConn runs. And I think it's really interesting because in the film breakdowns I've seen of Silas, I think he was in a very tough spot at Georgia, where they were talented this past year considering they had Asa Newell, but really outside of Blue Kane, Georgia really didn't have all too much spacing. And a lot of times, teams that played Georgia this past year, they would immediately blitz Silas, knowing how dynamic Silas can be off the dribble and being a scorer when he's looking to score. It forced him in a lot of tough spots to have to make a lot of tough passes. Now, in a program with the roster like UConn's, you have shooters all spaced out all over the floor. You have Solo Ball, you have Braylan Mullins, you have Alex Caravan, Jalen Stewart. I think now he's going to be in a position where he's not getting blitz as much. He's not seeing those double teams come running at him. He's going to be able to take guys on his own a lot off the dribble, break guys down the way he wasn't able to when he was facing those double teams and those traps. And worse comes worse, he does get trapped. Again, you have shooters all over the floor you can dish it out to, I should say, or you can dumb it down low to Tarris or Eric, ever one of those bigs is in the game at any given moment. And I think Silas is just in such a better position to really prove that, because this is something Silas talked about. He thinks a lot of people around the national media don't give him credit for being as good of a passer as he thinks he personally is. And I think that now in a UConn offense where he's not going to be getting trapped the way he was at Georgia, he's going to be able to showcase a lot more of the playmaking he brings to the table as opposed to what you saw out of his Georgia day. Because I know on paper the assist numbers aren't great. He was at around 3 in his final year at Georgia. But I think those numbers could end up jumping this year. I don't think he is the playmaker that Tristan was coming into UConn, but I definitely think Silas could get to that point. And I'm really excited to see it because I think he's could end up being one of the two most important players for this year's roster. Just between him and Tarris, I think those two are going to be the most instrumental in being the driving force for how far this UConn team can really go once we see how they get it through biggest play and the NCAA tournament. But I think overall it's going to take care of everything I have in terms of my thoughts from what I was able to take away from Dan Hurley's media availability. So again, I think Dan Hurley sounds a lot more confident about this year's roster. That's really been the whole theme of this year's offseason. With you saw what him and Dave Benedict put together with the out of conference scheduling and just how great those games should end up being. And just what Dan Hurley's had to say about this roster seems a lot more confident. The roles seem a lot more defined. The roster makeup just makes a lot more sense. And I think guys are going to make big leaps. I think guys are going to show out this year in STORRS. And I'm excited. I'm here for it. And season can't come any sooner. But until the next episode, I'll see you all next time.